Rose O'Neal Greenhow, the Wild Rose of the Confederacy, Washington, D.C. 1861. The nation is at war with itself. The city is a cauldron of whispers. Salons filled with politics, soldiers on every corner, neighbors uncertain who to trust, and in the heart of it all a woman whose beauty was rivaled only by her brilliance, a hostess, a widow, a mother, and a spy. Her name was Rose O'Neal Greenhow, the Wild Rose of the Confederacy. From orphan to socialite, she was born in obscurity. Around 1814 in Montgomery County, Maryland, orphaned young Rose was sent to live with her aunt in Washington, D.C. The capital was still a modest town then, but it was a place where charm, wit and ambition could open doors, and Rose had all three. Her beauty was undeniable. Raven black hair, piercing eyes, and a quick smile. But more dangerous than her looks was her intelligence. She absorbed politics and gossip like air, and by her early 20s she was one of the most sought-after hostesses in the city. Her home became a salon of power. Senators, diplomats, cabinet members, and generals all flocked to her parlor. It was here, between candlelight and champagne, that Rose mastered her most powerful weapon, influence. The making of a Confederate sympathizer. In 1835 she married Dr. Robert Greenhow, a respected scholar and diplomat. Through him her social connections deepened, reaching into the highest levels of American government. But tragedy struck when Robert died in a fatal accident, leaving Rose a widow with 4 daughters. She grieved, but she did not retreat. Instead, she wielded her social standing with even more determination. By the time the Civil War erupted in 1861, Rose's loyalties were no secret. She supported the South. Her reasons were complex, tied to heritage, belief in states' rights, and deep disdain for what she saw as Northern aggression. But above all, she believed the Confederacy must survive, and she would use every ounce of her charm to ensure it. The Confederate assignment. In the spring of 1861, the Confederate government reached out to Rose. They wanted her to establish an intelligence network in Washington, right under the nose of President Abraham Lincoln. She agreed without hesitation. Rose turned her parlor into a listening post. Senators confided in her. Union generals admired her. Even government clerks dropped secrets into casual conversation, unaware their words were destined for enemy ears. But Rose did not simply collect whispers. She wove them into strategy. She passed information south through coded messages, invisible ink, and trusted couriers. Her home became a spider's web, and every man who walked and risked becoming tangled. The secret ciphers. To mask her treachery, Rose developed intricate ciphers, strings of numbers and symbols hidden within letters she wrote in invisible ink, between the lines of personal correspondence. At times, she even stitched codes into the fabric of her clothing, ensuring that a simple shawl could carry secrets across enemy lines. One surviving note reads like a riddle, strings of digits concealing battle plans beneath the surface. Union officials would later marvel at the sophistication of her methods. But the Confederates were more than impressed. They were grateful, because in July 1861 Rose delivered her greatest triumph, the First Battle of Bull Run. Union forces were preparing to march on Confederate troops at Manassas, Virginia. The plan was bold: strike swiftly and crush the rebellion in its infancy. But Rose knew through her network. She learned the Unionist numbers, movements, and timing. She sent word south urging General Beauregard to brace for the coming storm. On July 21, 1861, Union and Confederate armies clashed at Bull Run, and when the smoke cleared, it was the Confederacy that stood victorious. Confederate President Jefferson Davis himself credited Rose O'Neal Greenhow with delivering the intelligence that secured their first major victory. In the words of one Southern officer, she outfought an entire Union brigade with nothing but her pen. The net tightens, but victories cast shadows. The Union soon suspected that secrets were leaking from Washington. In August 1861, Allen Pinkerton, head of the Union Secret Service, ordered Rose's home placed under surveillance. He posted guards outside her residence, intercepted her letters, and questioned her visitors. But even under watch, Rose could not be stopped. She devised ways to smuggle notes past the guards, sometimes rolling messages into tiny balls and tossing them from her balcony to Confederate couriers waiting in the dark. Yet Pinkerton was relentless, and soon Rose's luck began to run out. The arrest. On August 23, 1861, Union soldiers stormed her home. They found stacks of coded letters, maps, and correspondence with Confederate generals. The evidence was damning. Rose O'Neal Greenhow was placed under house arrest. Her parlor of whispers turned into a gilded cage. But even then she plotted. She continued to write, continued to pass messages. Guards were bribed. Letters slipped through cracks. Frustrated Union officials moved her and her youngest daughter, little Rose, to the old Capitol prison in Washington. The prison was cold, damp, and crowded with soldiers, smugglers, and spies. Yet even behind bars, Rose's charm did not fade. She turned guards into allies, fellow prisoners into confidants. Her letters to Confederate leaders still made their way south, sometimes hidden in the curls of her daughter's hair. Exiled to the South in 1862, the Union government decided Rose was too dangerous to keep in Washington. They released her, but only to send her south back into Confederate territory. Welcomed as a heroine, Rose was celebrated in Richmond. The Confederate Congress praised her. Jefferson Davis himself received her with gratitude. She was given new assignments to travel abroad, secure sympathy for the Southern cause, and perhaps even influence foreign governments. In 1863 she sailed to Europe. There she moved through the glittering courts of Paris and London, charming diplomats and aristocrats spreading the Confederate message. She even published a memoir, My Imprisonment and the First Year of Abolition Rule at Washington. Portraying herself as a martyr of Northern tyranny, her book sold widely, fueling pro-Southern sentiment overseas. The final voyage, but fate would not allow Rose to savor her triumph for long. In the fall of 1864 she boarded a blockade runner, a sleek, fast ship meant to slip past Union patrols, carrying gold dispatches and intelligence for the Confederacy. As the ship approached Wilmington, North Carolina, a Union vessel gave chase. In the chaos, the ship ran aground. Desperate to save her cargo, Rose clutched a bag of gold and tried to escape in a small boat, but the boat capsized, weighted down by the treasure she carried. Rose O'Neal Greenhouse sank beneath the waves when her body washed ashore. The bag of gold was still clutched in her arms. The Confederacy buried her with honors, draping her coffin in its flag. Soldiers and citizens mourned. To them she was not a spy, she was a patriot who gave everything, even her life, for their cause. The legend of the Wild Rose. Was she a patriot or a traitor? To the North she was a dangerous conspirator whose betrayal cost lives. To the South she was a heroine whose courage gave hope in the darkest days. But perhaps Rose was both. A woman of contradictions, fearless in her convictions, reckless in her devotion. Her story reminds us that wars are not fought only on battlefields. They are waged in drawing rooms, in whispered conversations, in coded letters, and in the courage of those willing to risk everything for their cause. And in that shadow war, Rose O'Neal Greenhouse was one of the most dangerous combatants of all. The Wild Rose of the Confederacy, a beauty, a spy, a symbol. Her roots may have been tangled, her loyalties divisive, but her legacy is undeniable. A salon of shadows, Rose's parlor had always been more than a place for fine tea and elegant conversation. It was a theater of persuasion. Each guest was both audience and actor, drawn into her orbit by charm they could not resist. Northern politicians described her eyes as two black stars burning with mischief. She never wasted a glance, never spoke without purpose. A senator might enter her home intending only a friendly chat, but by the time he left, his words had been catalogued, interpreted, and filed away in Rose's mental vault. To her, human vanity was the richest resource of all. Men wanted to be admired, respected, desired, and Rose knew exactly how to feed that hunger while gently extracting secrets from them like silk threads from a cocoon. The role of Little Rose. Few remember that her youngest daughter, nicknamed Little Rose, was not only a bystander but often a participant in her mother's espionage. The child with her curls and innocence was the perfect courier. Who would suspect a little girl of carrying coded notes? More than once Union soldiers searched the mother, yet ignored the daughter, who skipped away with intelligence braided into her hair or sewn into her doll's clothing. Even during imprisonment, Little Rose softened the cold walls of the old Capitol prison. Guards who might have treated Rose harshly often hesitated when faced with the child's presence. In a sense, her daughter became her shield, allowing Rose to continue her work under the noses of her captors. The Union's dilemma. Rose presented Abraham Lincoln's government with a profound problem. How do you punish a woman of such prominence? On one hand, the evidence of her treason was irrefutable. She had transmitted military intelligence that led to Union defeats and Union deaths. On the other hand, to execute her would risk turning her into a Confederate martyr, a Joan of Arc draped in Southern silk. Northern newspapers debated her fate. Some called her a serpent in velvet. Others mocked her as a vain socialite playing spy games, yet beneath the ridicule lay fear. They knew her whispers had altered the course of battle. In the end, Union leaders chose exile over execution. They hoped banishment to the South would strip her of influence. Ironically, it only magnified her legend. The Confederate muse abroad. Rose's journey to Europe in 1863 was not a vacation. It was a mission of persuasion. She met with dukes, ambassadors, and even lords of parliament. She argued that the South deserved recognition as an independent nation, though she could not sway governments to formally recognize the Confederacy. Her presence caused ripples. Aristocrats whispered about the bewitching widow of Washington. Her memoir, translated and circulated painted the North as tyrannical and the South as noble underdogs. French papers compared her to the heroines of old revolutions. British salons invited her, not only for her politics, but for the sheer spectacle of her personality. She became less a diplomat than a symbol, the face of Southern defiance in silk gowns and pearls. Psychology of a spy. What drove Rose? Some historians argue it was ideology, her unwavering belief in the Southern cause. Others suggest it was a thirst for relevance, a determination to carve her name into history. In a world where women were often denied power, perhaps both are true. Rose herself once wrote, "I am as capable of serving my country as any soldier who bears a musket." To her, espionage was not merely service. It was proof that intellect and charm could be weapons as sharp as swords. Unlike Mata Hari, who decades later would become a symbol of seduction, in Espionage Rose's appeal lay in her audacity. She dared to play the same political chess as the men around her, and often she outplayed them. A network of women, though remembered as a solitary figure, Rose was not alone. Her network included other Southern sympathizers, many of them women, housewives, servants, shopkeepers, even Washington socialites quietly aligned with her cause. Rose recognized that women were underestimated, seen as ornaments or hostesses. That underestimation became her camouflage. She mobilized a silent army of overlooked women who carried letters, memorized details, and smuggled supplies. This sisterhood of spies rarely made headlines, but together they created an invisible web. Across Washington, Rose was its queen, pulling threads that stretched from ballrooms to battlefields. Her daughter's memory. After Rose's death in 1864, little Rose was left adrift, a child marked by both fame and scandal. Letters from her later life revealed the shadow her mother cast. She recalled nights in prison, the weight of secrets she carried as a girl, and the image of her mother's body brought back from the sea. For little Rose, memory was a burden. Pride tangled with grief. She loved her mother, but she knew that loyalty to a cause had cost her a parent. Historians often focus on Rose the spy, but through her daughter's eyes we glimpse Rose the mother, tender, protective, but ultimately consumed by her mission, fear, and fascination. Union officers who dealt with Rose often admitted a grudging admiration. Pinkerton himself described her as one of the most dangerous persons in all of Washington. Dangerous not because she carried weapons, but because she understood the battlefield of human weakness. She knew how to flatter, how to intimidate, how to manipulate, and yet there was fascination too. Even her enemies found her magnetic. When she walked into a room, conversation shifted and eyes followed. This paradox, despised yet admired, made her all the more powerful. Myth. After death, the Confederacy buried Rose with honors, but death was only the beginning of her legend. Southern writers hailed her as the Wild Rose, comparing her to heroines of classical antiquity. Ballads were sung, poems written. Her story became part of Confederate mythology, proof that women could fight for the cause as fiercely as men in the North. Her image was darker. She was vilified as reckless, selfish, and fatally arrogant. Union writers used her as a cautionary tale, a warning against women who strayed into the affairs of war. Yet even in condemnation, they could not erase her impact. Rose O'Neal Greenhow had made herself unforgettable legacy in the Shadow War. Espionage has always thrived in shadows, but stories like Rose's remind us of its profound effect. A single message, a single whisper can tip the scales of history. The victory at Bull Run, credited partly to her intelligence, extended the Civil War by years, costing countless lives. One could argue that without Rose, the Confederacy might have collapsed sooner. Her life raises uncomfortable questions. Is loyalty noble if it serves a cause built on slavery? Can courage be admired even when tied to a flawed ideology? Should history remember her as a patriot, a traitor, or simply a woman who refused to be irrelevant? Perhaps the truth lies in the contradictions. Rose was all of these things at once: mother, spy, seductor, strategist, and martyr. A candle flickers in an empty parlor. The sound of distant cannons echoes through the night. On a table lies a half-written letter, ink still fresh. A child's laughter fades down a hallway. She believed words could shape wars. She believed charm could alter destinies, and in her belief she changed the course of history. Rose O'Neal Greenhow, the spy who turned whispers into weapons and paid with her life for the weight of the secrets she carried. Ethel Rosenberg, the Cold War's tragic spy or scapegoat. In an America gripped by fear, where the Cold War turned neighbor against neighbor, two names ignited a firestorm of suspicion: Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, convicted of espionage, sentenced to die. Their story remains one of the most haunting mysteries of the 20th century. Were they traitors who betrayed their country to the Soviet Union, or victims of hysteria sacrificed to America's paranoia? A childhood in New York. Her parents, Jewish immigrants from Russia, worked hard but remained poor. Young Ethel found escape in her voice. She dreamed of becoming a singer, a star. For a time she sang in choirs, her voice carrying hope beyond the gray walls of the city. But her stage was not destined to be Broadway. It would be the courtroom of history. In her early years, Ethel also grew fiercely political, living through the Great Depression. She saw friends lose jobs, families starve, and children shiver in winter. To her, capitalism seemed cruel. Like many of her generation, she was drawn toward leftist ideals, equality, justice, and the dream of a better system. This ideology would shape her path, and eventually her fate meeting Julius Rosenberg. In 1936, at a gathering of left-leaning activists, Ethel met a young man, Julius Rosenberg. He was intelligent, passionate, and utterly devoted to his political ideals. He was also deeply involved in communist circles, a believer in the Soviet Union's vision for Ethel. Julius was not just a husband, but a partner in a larger mission. They married in 1939 and soon built a modest life together, raising two sons, Michael and Robert. Their home was filled with books, debates, and dreams of social justice. Yet beneath the warmth of family life ran currents of secrecy. Julius, an electrical engineer for the U.S. Army Signal Corps, had access to classified military information. He was recruited into a Soviet spy network, passing secrets during World War II. Did Ethel know? Did she encourage him? This question would divide historians for decades. The atomic age and fear of betrayal. By the late 1940s, the world had changed forever. The United States had dropped atomic bombs on Japan, ushering in the nuclear age. For a brief moment, America stood alone with this terrifying power. But in 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The U.S. was stunned. How had the Soviets built their bombs so quickly? The answer, many believed, was espionage. American secrets had been stolen, treason had occurred, and the hunt for traitors began. The FBI traced leaks back to spy networks operating within the United States. Among those implicated, Julius Rosenberg, and through him his wife Ethel. The arrest in the summer of 1950. Julius was arrested. Weeks later, agents came for Ethel. She was accused of typing notes of atomic secrets, helping her husband organize contacts, and acting as a full partner in espionage. But the evidence was murky. The government had no typed documents in her hand, no direct witness who saw her pass information. Instead, the case relied on testimony, most notably from her own brother David Greenglass. David, a machinist at Los Alamos, the heart of the Manhattan Project, confessed to passing atomic information to Julius to protect his wife. He claimed Ethel had typed up his notes. That single accusation became the nail in her coffin. The trial of the century. In 1951, the Rosenbergs were put on trial in New York City. The atmosphere was electric, charged with Cold War paranoia. Senators, journalists, and ordinary citizens crowded the courtroom, desperate to see whether these Spies were truly guilty. The prosecution painted Ethel as cold, calculating, and dangerous. They said she betrayed her country not for money, but for ideology, the most frightening motive of all. The defense argued she was innocent, a housewife dragged into her husband's world. Her role, they said, was exaggerated to pressure Julius into confessing, yet the jury was swayed. The climate of fear was overwhelming. The judge declared, "By your betrayal, you have undoubtedly altered the course of history, to the disadvantage of our country. I consider your crime worse than murder." Both Julius and Ethel were sentenced to death. America divided. The verdict shocked the world. Some Americans cheered, convinced the Rosenbergs were guilty traitors. Others recoiled, horrified that the U.S. government would send a woman, and mother of two young boys, to the electric chair on such thin evidence. Across Europe, protests erupted in Paris, Rome, and London. Demonstrators marched shouting, "Save the Rosenbergs." Intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre and Pablo Picasso condemned the trial as a political witch hunt. Even the Pope pleaded for mercy. But President Dwight D. Eisenhower refused clemency. He declared that sparing the Rosenbergs would encourage others to betray their country. Letters from prison. Behind prison walls, Ethel wrote letters that revealed both her strength and her anguish. She proclaimed her innocence, insisting she had been framed by lies. She wrote tenderly to her sons, urging them to live with courage and integrity. In one letter she said, "We are the first victims of American fascism." Whether one agrees or not, those words echo the mood of the early 1950s, a time when fear silenced dissent, when to be accused was nearly to be condemned. The execution on June 19, 1953. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were executed at Sing Sing prison in New York. Julius went first. Ethel followed minutes later. Witnesses reported a chilling scene. The electric chair was designed for men. Ethel, a smaller frame, required multiple jolts before her heart stopped. Some newspapers described it in gruesome detail, sparking public outrage. Their sons, just 6 and 10 years old, were left orphaned, adopted by a family friend. 9 Evidence revisited for decades. Historians debated, was Ethel guilty? Soviet archives opened after the Cold War revealed Julius was indeed a spy. He passed valuable industrial and military secrets. But Ethel? The evidence was thinner. Declassified documents suggest she was aware of Julius's activities, perhaps supportive, but not a central player. Even David Greenglass years later admitted he lied on the stand to protect his wife and save himself. He confessed that Ethel had never typed the notes. His perjury had helped send his sister to her death. This revelation deepened the tragedy. If Ethel was not an active spy, then her execution was not justice. It was vengeance. The ghost of Ethel Rosenberg. Ethel's name lingers as a symbol of the Cold War's extremes. To some, she was a traitor who endangered millions. To others, she was a scapegoat, a woman sacrificed to fear, punished more for who she was than for what she did. Her sons Michael and Robert spent their lives fighting to clear her name in interviews. They described their parents not as villains, but as idealists caught in a storm of hysteria. Today many historians agree Julius was guilty, but Ethel's role was exaggerated, her execution unnecessary. Yet history rarely deals in absolutes. What remains is ambiguity and a question. How far will nations go when fear eclipses justice? The Cold War was not fought only on battlefields or in boardrooms. It was fought in courtrooms, in headlines, in the electric hum of a prison chamber. Ethel Rosenberg's name is etched in that history, a reminder of how truth can vanish in the smoke of fear, and how the line between justice and vengeance can blur until it disappears. The Red Scare. A nation on edge. The 1950s were an age of suspicion. Senator Joseph McCarthy thundered about communist infiltration in every corner of American life. Actors, writers, teachers, anyone with leftist leanings could suddenly find themselves blacklisted. The Rosenbergs' trial unfolded against this backdrop. To the public, they were not just two individuals accused of espionage. They became the embodiment of American fear, a warning to anyone tempted to deviate from the patriotic norm. Ethel Rosenberg, a woman, mother, and homemaker, was transformed into a symbol of ideological betrayal. She wasn't accused of selling secrets for personal wealth, but of helping an enemy in the name of political loyalty. That made her, in the government's eyes, far more dangerous. The question of gender. Part of what shocked the world was not only that the United States executed spies, but that one of them was a woman. Women in 1950s America were seen as nurturers, wives, mothers, not conspirators in shadow wars. The image of Ethel Rosenberg sitting in court, calm and composed, contrasted sharply with society's expectations. The prosecution leaned into this, painting her as cold and unfeeling. Instead of highlighting her letters of love to her children, newspapers described her as ice-hearted, a woman capable of betraying her nation as easily as she tucked her children into bed. This gendered framing was not accidental. To execute a woman, the government needed to portray her as extraordinary, not a victim but a villain, and so the narrative hardened. Ethel was not a housewife, but a mastermind, not a mother, but a traitor. The media storm headlines blared. Adam Spies faced death. Cartoons depicted the Rosenbergs passing glowing bombs to grinning Soviet agents. American newspapers often omitted details that might have cast doubt on her involvement. The shaky testimony of her brother, the absence of physical evidence. These nuances vanished beneath sensationalist ink, but across the Atlantic the tone was very different. European media outlets, particularly in France and Italy, portrayed the Rosenbergs as martyrs. Intellectuals saw the case as proof of America's drift toward authoritarianism. For many, the Rosenbergs became symbols of resistance against political witch hunts. The children left behind. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of Ethel Rosenberg's execution was not her death, but the lives of her sons Michael and Robert, just 6 and 10 when their parents were taken from them, carried the burden of a last name synonymous with treason. In school they were bullied and ostracized. Teachers whispered, neighbors looked away. For years they lived in foster homes until they were adopted by Abel and in Mirapole. Abel was a schoolteacher, but also a songwriter, famous for writing Strange Fruit, the haunting anti-lynching ballad made immortal by Billie Holiday. The Mirapoles gave the boys love, stability, and a new sense of belonging, but they never erased the shadow of their parents' execution. As adults, Michael and Robert became activists, historians, and voices for justice. They campaigned to clear their mother's name, producing books, documentaries, and public appeals. Through them, Ethel Rosenberg's ghost never left American history, literature, theater, and memory. The Rosenberg case seeped into culture. Playwright Arthur Miller was inspired by the hysteria of their trial when writing The Crucible, his allegory of the Salem witch trials. Though not directly about the Rosenbergs, the play's theme, how fear can corrupt justice, echoed their story. In poetry and songs and novels, the Rosenbergs became shorthand for the dangers of political paranoia. Bob Dylan referenced them in his early folk ballads. Writers in France described Ethel as a secular martyr condemned not for her deeds but for her beliefs. Even decades later, works like Tony Kushner's Angels in America and El Doctoro's The Book of Daniel revisited the case, using fiction to ask questions history could not resolve. Was Ethel guilty, or was she sacrificed to prove America's resolve against communism? International fallout. The execution of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg sent shockwaves far beyond U.S. borders. In the Soviet Union, state media painted them as heroic victims of capitalist cruelty. For America, which prided itself as the leader of the free world, the optics were complicated. By choosing execution, the government hardened its anti-communist stance, but also handed its critics ammunition. To many abroad, America looked less like the defender of democracy and more like a nation consumed by vengeance. Cold War propaganda and legacy. The Rosenberg case became a weapon in the propaganda war. American leaders pointed to it as proof of communist infiltration, justification for loyalty oaths, and the expansion of security services. Soviet leaders meanwhile used the case to paint the U.S. as a brutal and unjust society. Ethel herself, though, was largely erased from official narratives. For decades, history books in American classrooms mentioned Julius Rosenberg as a spy, but Ethel was a footnote. Her guilt was assumed, her death treated as collateral damage. Only later, with declassified documents, did her role re-emerge as a subject of serious debate. Reconsideration in modern times. In 2015, on what would have been her 100th birthday, historians and activists gathered in New York to honor Ethel Rosenberg. They argued that while Julius's espionage was confirmed, Ethel had been wrongfully convicted and unjustly executed. Her son spoke at the event, calling for an official exoneration. They acknowledged their father's guilt, but insisted their mother had been used as leverage, punished not for actions, but for refusing to betray her husband. No U.S. administration has issued a pardon, but the debate itself shows how her case continues to haunt America's conscience. A symbol for women in espionage history, Ethel Rosenberg's story also intersects with the broader history of women in espionage. Unlike glamorous figures such as Mata Hari or bold operatives like Virginia Hall, Ethel's alleged espionage was invisible, domestic, tied to her role as wife and mother. This made her case unique, and in some ways more frightening to the public. If even an ordinary woman could be a spy, then anyone could. The trial reinforced a narrative that loyalty could not be trusted even within the home. The lasting question in the end. The story of Ethel Rosenberg is not just about espionage. It is about justice in times of fear, about how societies treat women who step outside their expected roles, about how children carry the burdens of their parents' names. Her execution was meant to close a chapter. Instead, it opened a wound that still bleeds into debates about government power, civil liberties, and the price of dissent. Ethel Rosenberg's name is not carved on monuments nor sung in anthems, but in the silence after her execution, in the questions that still echo decades later. She remains a figure both tragic and defiant, a mother, a wife, an accused spy, a reminder that truth once caught in the machinery of fear may never be set free. Agent Melita Norwood, known as the spy who came in from the co-op, she lived a quiet, ordinary British life, while secretly working as one of the longest-serving Soviet spies in history. Her story is fascinating because she blended invisibility, loyalty, and betrayal in ways very different from the glamorous or daring operatives we've covered so far. Her early life and political awakening, recruitment, and her decades-long espionage career, how she stole secrets from inside Britain's atomic research establishment, her quiet double life balancing family, gardening, and treason, her unmasking in the 1990s, and why she was never prosecuted. Her legacy as the least likely spy. Soft rustle of leaves, a suburban street in Bexleyheath, South London. Birds sing in the distance. An elderly woman tends to her roses, pruning carefully, wearing a cardigan and gardening gloves. To her neighbors, she was just Mrs. Norwood, polite, quiet, the sort of woman who borrowed sugar and talked about the weather. For nearly 40 years she worked as a secretary in Britain's scientific establishment, a modest role in a male-dominated field. But behind the facade of teapots and garden sheds lay one of the greatest espionage secrets of the 20th century. For decades, this woman, Melita Norwood, passed Britain's nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union, and she did it undetected, almost invisibly, until the end of her life. A radical upbringing. Melita Norwood was born in 1912 in Bournemouth on England's south coast. Her father was a Latvian émigré, a committed socialist, and her mother came from a family that valued education and progressive politics. While other girls were learning domestic crafts, she was reading Marx, Lenin, and pamphlets about workers' rights. She excelled academically and eventually studied Latin and logic at University College London. But it was not books alone that shaped her growing up between two world wars. She saw unemployment, poverty, and hunger spread across Britain. The suffering of working-class families ignited in her a conviction that capitalism was failing ordinary people. To her, socialism and communism were not abstract ideologies. They were the promise of justice. Recruitment into espionage. In the 1930s, Melita joined leftist circles, including the Communist Party of Great Britain. It was there she caught the attention of Soviet recruiters, the NKVD. The Soviet intelligence service was not looking for flamboyant characters. They wanted people who could blend in, people with access. Melita fit the profile perfectly: quiet, disciplined, idealistic, and crucially, employed as a secretary in the British Non-Ferrous Metals Research Association. A mouthful of a name, but a place of enormous significance. This research facility was tied to Britain's wartime atomic program. Scientists there were laying the foundations of nuclear weapons, and every day Melita typed their reports, filed their notes, and carried their documents. She was the unnoticed gatekeeper to the West's most sensitive secrets. By 1937, she was recruited by Soviet intelligence. Her codename was Hola, a spy in the shadows. Melita's espionage style was not James Bond, not car chases or silenced pistols. It was dull, routine office work and quiet moments of betrayal. She passed film canisters in meetings with her handlers, sometimes disguised as casual strolls in the park. On other occasions, she left documents at pre-arranged dead drops. Her greatest contribution came during and after World War II. Britain, alongside the US and Canada, was developing nuclear technology while the Americans launched the Manhattan Project. The British effort was codenamed Tube Alloys, and Melita, the secretary with access to filing cabinets, was slipping these blueprints to Moscow. What she provided helped the Soviet Union accelerate its own nuclear weapons program. When the USSR detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, many in the West were stunned. How had the Soviets caught up so quickly? The answer lay partly in the quiet work of agents like Melita Norwood. The double life at home. Melita was ordinary to the point of invisibility. She married a left-wing teacher, Bert Norwood, in 1935. They lived in a modest house in Bexleyheath, raised a daughter, and paid their bills like everyone else. Her neighbors never suspected her of anything unusual. She gardened, she volunteered at the local co-op, she rode her bicycle through town. She looked in every way like the archetypal English housewife, but beneath this domestic calm, she carried the weight of betrayal. For decades she served the Soviet Union with unwavering loyalty. Unlike many spies, she was not motivated by money. She received little financial reward for her work. Instead, her drive was ideological. She believed the Soviet Union was humanity's best hope for equality, and that by sharing secrets, she was leveling the playing field. To her, this wasn't treason, it was justice. The Cold War heats up. The 1950s and 1960s saw the Cold War turn into a global chess match. From Korea to Cuba, from Berlin to Vietnam, the world was divided between East and West. Nuclear weapons loomed at the center of it all, and Melita's secrets were part of that high-stakes rivalry. She provided Soviet handlers with intelligence on Britain's nuclear research materials, science, and even details of collaboration with American labs. Every memo she passed tightened the Soviet grip on nuclear parity, yet still nobody suspected her. British counterintelligence was obsessed with glamorous double agents, the Cambridge Five figures like Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, and Donald MacLean. These men drew attention with their elite education and bold betrayals. Meanwhile, Melita, the quiet secretary, slipped under the radar. Exposure deferred. Her career might have gone entirely unnoticed had it not been for the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. Defectors and archives began to reveal the extent of Soviet espionage during the Cold War. Among the names that surfaced was Hola, Melita Norwood. In 1999, her story broke in the press. Journalists descended on her quiet suburban home, stunned that an 87-year-old widow with a gentle smile could have been one of the most important Soviet spies in British history. Melita did not deny it. Standing in her garden, she calmly told reporters, "I did what I did not to make money, but to help prevent the defeat of a new system, which had at great cost given ordinary people food and fares which they could afford, good education, and a health service." It was a startling admission, not of regret but of pride. Why she was never prosecuted. One of the most puzzling aspects of Melita Norwood's case is that she was never prosecuted. The British government, perhaps embarrassed by the decades-long failure to catch her, decided not to press charges. Officials argued she was too old to frail, and that prosecuting her would serve little purpose, but critics saw something else. They believed the government wanted to avoid public humiliation, to admit that a suburban secretary had under their noses leaked nuclear secrets for 40 years. So Melita lived out her remaining days in quiet retirement, unpunished, unapologetic, and unrepentant. She died in 2005 at the age of 93. Legacy of the invisible spy. Unlike Mata Hari, who danced across headlines, or Anna Chapman, whose glamour drew paparazzi, Melita Norwood's legacy is one of quiet persistence. She was not flashy, not famous. She did not live luxuriously or demand recognition. She simply worked in silence for decades. Historians now rank her among the most damaging spies Britain ever produced. The intelligence she passed almost certainly hastened the Soviet Union's development of nuclear weapons, yet her story also raises haunting questions. What makes a traitor? Is it loyalty to one's nation or loyalty to an idea greater than a nation? For Melita, the answer was clear. She betrayed her country, but in her mind she served humanity. Melita Norwood never carried a gun, never broke into safes, never fired a shot in anger. She lived instead as an ordinary woman in extraordinary times. Her weapon was a typewriter, her battlefield was the filing cabinet, and her war was waged not for profit but for conviction. In the quiet streets of Bexleyheath, the most unlikely of spies changed the course of history and walked away unseen. The Soviet perspective, a jewel in the shadows to Soviet intelligence officers. Melita Norwood was far more valuable than her modest exterior suggested. While many Western spies recruited by Moscow were flamboyant defectors from high society or reckless double agents, Norwood represented something different: longevity and loyalty. She never demanded recognition. She never argued with her handlers about payments or escape plans. She simply delivered, year after year, decade after decade. In the archives of the KGB and its predecessor, the NKVD, her codename Hola appears frequently in reports. Soviet officers praised her reliability, noting that she never failed to meet a deadline, and that her documents were always meticulously copied. Unlike some spies who constantly feared exposure, Melita appeared calm, even serene, as if her espionage was just another form of daily work. One officer is reported to have said, "Comrade Hola is the type of agent every service dreams of. She asks for little, gives much, and vanishes into the crowd." Her lack of drama ironically made her priceless. MI5's blind spot for Britain's counterintelligence agency MI5. Melita Norwood's case became an enduring embarrassment. Throughout the Cold War, MI5 was focused on high-profile suspects, diplomats, aristocrats, and the infamous Cambridge Five. They believed spies would come from elite backgrounds, not suburban living rooms. Their failure to consider the ordinary was a strategic oversight. A secretary like Melita, with access to nuclear research files, did not fit their stereotype of a spy. She was too plain, too invisible, that invisibility became her cloak. When she was finally unmasked in 1999, MI5 scrambled to explain why had they never even questioned her. Why had decades of counterintelligence sweeps missed the woman who sat at the heart of Britain's atomic research network? The truth was simple and humiliating. They underestimated her. To them, she was just a secretary. And so Britain's nuclear secrets slipped quietly into Soviet hands, carried not by glamorous agents, but by a grandmotherly figure with a shopping bag. The ethics of betrayal. Melita's story raises deep ethical questions to the British state. She was a traitor, someone who betrayed her oath of loyalty, who passed information to the enemy, who endangered national security. But in Melita's own mind, the narrative was inverted. She wasn't betraying Britain. She was betraying capitalism. She saw herself as a servant of humanity, not a servant of government. She once said in an interview, "I thought perhaps what I had access to might be useful in helping Russia to keep abreast of Britain, America, and Germany. I felt I had to do what I could to help those who were helping Russia." Her words reveal the complexity of espionage. For some spies, money is the motivator. For others, blackmail. For Melita, it was ideology, a belief in communism so deep that she placed it above national loyalty. Her case forces us to ask, when does loyalty to an idea outweigh loyalty to a passport? The gender advantage. One of the least discussed aspects of Melita Norwood's success is her gender. In the mid-20th century, women were often dismissed in professional environments. Secretaries in particular were considered passive record keepers, not active participants. This cultural bias became her greatest weapon. Male scientists around her never considered that the woman typing up their notes could be a conduit for espionage. To them, she was invisible, part of the furniture. Soviet handlers recognized this. They understood that underestimation could be a cover. Stronger than any disguise by being a woman in a man's world, Melita moved freely unnoticed. While male counterparts like Philby were constantly scrutinized, her case demonstrates that sometimes invisibility is more effective than glamour, the ordinary habits of an extraordinary spy. What makes Melita's story cinematic is the contrast between her life's two halves. On the one hand, she engaged in acts of espionage that altered the balance of the Cold War. On the other, she led an unremarkable suburban life. Neighbors recalled her as polite, slightly old-fashioned, fond of gardening and community meetings. She cycled to the shops, she drank tea with biscuits. Her home was modest, filled with books and papers, but nothing extraordinary. This ordinariness was her armor. It's difficult to imagine James Bond hiding for decades in plain sight. But a woman who brings sponge cake to the neighborhood bake sale? Nobody suspects her of treason. Her genius lay in the fact that she never tried to appear different. She embraced the role of ordinary Englishwoman so completely that it became the perfect mask, the ripple effect of her espionage. The intelligence Melita passed did not exist in a vacuum. It had consequences. Soviet scientists, already talented in their own right, received data that shaved years off their research. By accelerating the Soviet nuclear program, she contributed to the arms race reaching equilibrium earlier. When the USSR detonated its first bomb in 1949, it shocked the West. That shock shaped U.S. foreign policy, hardened the Cold War divide, and fueled an arms buildup that defined the second half of the 20th century. Some historians argue that by helping the Soviets achieve parity, Melita may have prevented nuclear monopoly by the U.S. and Britain, which could have been catastrophic for global peace. Others argue the opposite, that she prolonged the Cold War by ensuring both sides were equally armed. In either case, her actions changed the world in ways far greater than her quiet demeanor suggested. Unmasking the media frenzy. When her identity was revealed in 1999, the media could not resist the contrast. An 87-year-old grandmother revealed as one of the most effective Soviet spies in history. The headlines were sensational. The spy who came in from the garden. The Granny Spy television crew surrounded her house, baffled by the image of a frail woman smiling calmly at questions about nuclear treason, and Melita, ever steady, responded with a mix of candor and defiance. She didn't apologize, she didn't break down. Instead, she doubled down, insisting she had acted from conviction. Her demeanor disarmed many. She was not the caricature of a dangerous spy, she was ordinary. And that made her story all the more chilling. Why no prosecution? The decision not to prosecute her remains controversial. Critics argue that justice was denied, that a clear act of treason went unpunished. But the government's reasoning was pragmatic. To put an elderly widow on trial would create international spectacle. It would force Britain to admit decades of counterintelligence failure, and in practical terms, what would be gained? Melita was near the end of her life. A prison sentence would achieve little, so she was allowed to remain free. Some say this was mercy, others say it was cowardice. In either case, Melita lived her final years peacefully. Unrepentant memory and legacy. Today, Melita Norwood occupies a strange place in the history of espionage. She is not as infamous as Mata Hari, not as glamorized as Anna Chapman, not as legendary as Virginia Hall, but in terms of sheer longevity and damage, she outranks many. Her story has been the subject of books and documentaries. In 2018, the film Red Joan, starring Judi Dench, was loosely inspired by her case. While dramatized, the film captures the essence of her quiet conviction and the moral ambiguity of her choices. For historians, Melita's case is a lesson in humility. Never underestimate the ordinary for intelligence agencies. It is a reminder that spies are not always glamorous defectors or daring infiltrators. Sometimes they are the neighbor who waves politely over the hedge. As the Cold War fades into history, the figure of Melita Norwood lingers like a shadow in the garden. She was not violent, not greedy, not flamboyant. She was steady, patient, and convinced she was on the right side of history. Her espionage was both monumental and mundane, global in consequence, yet domestic in execution. She was in every sense the invisible spy, proof that history is not only shaped by generals, presidents, and scientists, but also by secretaries with strong convictions and steady hands. The femme fatale of espionage. Soft music plays, a candlelit room, a glass of wine on the table. The camera lingers on a woman's hand, tracing the rim of the glass as sultry voiceover begins. In war, soldiers carry rifles, but some warriors carry nothing more than a smile, a glance, a whispered promise in the dark. During World War II, one such warrior changed the course of history. Not with bullets, but with secrets. Her name was Amy Elizabeth Thorpe, known to the world as Betty. Pack. To her enemies she was a seductress. To her allies she was a patriot, and to history she was one of the most daring and controversial spies who ever lived. The making of a spy. Amy Elizabeth Thorpe was born in 1910 in Minneapolis, USA, to a well-off family. From the beginning she was described as strikingly beautiful, tall, blonde, and magnetic. But beauty was only half of her weapon. She was also clever, witty, and fearless, traits that would carry her far beyond the life expected of a young woman of her era. As a teenager, she moved to Washington, D.C., where she caught the eye of diplomats and politicians. She learned early how power worked, in backrooms and whispers, and sometimes in bedrooms. By the time she married Arthur Pack, a British diplomat, her life was already entangled with international affairs. But it was not her husband's career that would make her famous. It was her own. Recruited by British intelligence when World War II loomed, British intelligence agencies scoured their networks for people who could help in unorthodox ways. Amy, or Betty as friends called her, was a natural candidate. She had beauty, connections, and a reputation for boldness. Officially, she was recruited by British Security Coordination (BSC) in the US, later working closely with the SOE and OSS. Unofficially, she was tasked with assignments that required not just brains but charm. Her mission profile was clear: infiltrate enemy embassies, seduce high-ranking men, and extract their secrets. It was a dangerous game, but Betty thrived on the thrill. The seduction of secrets. Perhaps her most famous assignment took place in Washington, D.C. in the early 1940s. Her target, the Vichy French embassy, which held vital naval codes. These codes could unlock German communications and allow the Allies to anticipate U-boat movements in the Atlantic. Cracking them meant saving countless ships and lives. But the French embassy was a fortress of security. No spy could simply walk in and steal the papers. Unless, of course, that spy was Amy Elizabeth Thorpe. Betty set her sights on a French official. Using her charm, she drew him into a romantic affair. He fell deeply, helplessly under her spell, and when the moment was right, she convinced him to help her break into the code room. The story reads like a Hollywood script. One night, with the Frenchman's help, Betty and her team managed to copy the Vichy codebooks. Those stolen secrets were passed to the Allies and became a decisive intelligence victory. Some historians argue this single operation helped turn the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic, allowing convoys to avoid German U-boats. Lives were saved and supply lines remained open, all thanks to a woman society dismissed as just a seductress. The Italian coup. Betty's audacity didn't end there. In another mission, she targeted the Italian embassy in Washington. Italian diplomats were known for their caution, but Betty knew how to weave her way through defenses. She engaged in an affair with the Italian naval attaché. Gaining his trust and affection through him, she gained access to sensitive Italian naval codes, which were copied and shared with British intelligence. These codes provided insight into Axis naval operations, contributing to Allied dominance in the Mediterranean. Once again, Betty's combination of romance and espionage delivered a priceless prize. The Spanish operation. Another dramatic mission unfolded in Spain. The Spanish were officially neutral but leaned toward Axis cooperation. Their intelligence network was valuable and heavily guarded. It was intelligence that confirmed the extent of Nazi influence in Spain and helped the Allies shape their diplomatic strategies to keep Spain from fully siding with Hitler. The femme fatale reputation. By now, Amy Elizabeth Thorpe was gaining a reputation inside intelligence circles as the ultimate femme fatale. Some admired her, others despised her. There were whispers that she was reckless, that she enjoyed seduction too much, that she blurred the line between duty and desire. But even her critics couldn't deny the results. She delivered intelligence that others simply could not obtain. She herself dismissed the criticism. Wars are not won by respectable methods. She once remarked her morality was irrelevant compared to saving lives and defeating fascism. The OSS connection. Betty later worked closely with the Office of Strategic Services (OSS), the American predecessor of the CIA. She was deeply involved in operations across Europe, where her courage went beyond seduction. In one mission, she served as a courier smuggling documents across enemy lines. On another, she helped organize resistance contacts in Spain and North Africa. Unlike the stereotype of a mere seductress, Betty proved herself capable of high-risk fieldwork. OSS officers respected her. Daring one even called her the greatest unsung heroine of the war. The price of espionage. But the life of a spy is never without cost. Betty's marriage to Arthur Pack crumbled under the weight of her double life. Her reputation suffered as rumors of her affairs spread in an era When women were harshly judged, she was branded immoral, even scandalous. Yet Betty never apologized. She insisted that her actions, no matter how unconventional, were in service of a higher cause. Patriotism is not confined to a single method. She argued for her seduction was simply another weapon in the arsenal of war. Later years after the war, Betty lived a quieter life, marrying Charles Bruce, one of her wartime lovers. She retreated from the limelight, moving to France. She rarely spoke publicly about her wartime activities. In fact, much of her story remained hidden, until declassified records revealed the extent of her operations. Betty Pack died in 1963 at the age of 53. She was buried quietly with little fanfare. To the world, she was forgotten. But within the secret archives of intelligence history, she was remembered as a legend. Legacy of a seduction spy. Today, Amy Elizabeth Thorpe is recognized as one of the most effective female spies of World War II. She represents the complex, often controversial role of women in espionage. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Can seduction be as powerful as a bullet? Can intimacy be justified as a weapon of war? Historians continue to debate her legacy. Some see her as a heroine who saved lives by using every tool at her disposal. Others see her as a manipulative figure who blurred the line between personal pleasure and duty. But whatever judgment history passes, one fact remains undeniable. Betty Pack secured intelligence that shaped the outcome of battles and saved thousands of lives. She may not have worn a uniform or carried a gun, but she was a warrior nonetheless. The smile that changed a war. She was a spy who carried no weapon, fought no battle, but left an impact as great as any general. Amy Elizabeth Thorpe, the woman who proved that sometimes the heart is mightier than the sword. The psychology of a seductress. Every spy has a weapon. For some, it is a revolver. For others, a camera hidden in a briefcase. For Amy Elizabeth Thorpe, her weapon was herself. But what drove a woman to turn her very identity into a battlefield tool? Those who knew her described her as bold, restless, and almost addicted to danger. Friends recalled that she often seemed bored by normal society. Cocktail parties and polite conversations held little meaning for her unless there was a hidden edge, a secret, a risk, a forbidden adventure. Psychologists who later studied wartime espionage suggested that Betty had a thrill-seeker-esque personality. Some even likened her to gamblers or race car drivers drawn to situations that tested the boundaries of life and death. But unlike adrenaline junkies, Betty had another layer. She believed her risks had purpose. She wasn't just playing games with men's emotions. She was shaping the course of the war. The debate inside intelligence circles. Betty's methods were effective, but controversial. Within the British intelligence community, arguments erupted about the ethics of seduction. As a tactic, some officers were pragmatic. If she could deliver results that others could not, why criticize her? For them, espionage was a dirty game and morality was a luxury no one could afford. But others, particularly more conservative figures in surmise, were scandalized. They considered her behavior unbecoming, a liability to Britain's reputation. There were fears that if her exploits were exposed, enemies would portray Britain as using immoral women to corrupt men. One intelligence report even noted, her talents are unusual, her methods unorthodox, but the material she provides is of undeniable value. It was as if the agencies couldn't decide whether to condemn her or celebrate her men in the shadow of her success. Espionage during WWII was still largely a man's game. Male officers were trained, armed, and celebrated as heroes. Women were often relegated to couriers, code clerks, or assistants. Betty shattered that hierarchy. She obtained intelligence that outclassed the work of many decorated men, and she did it without guns or bombs. This success unsettled some of her male counterparts. There are accounts of jealous officers sneering that her achievements weren't real espionage. They dismissed her work as pillow talk rather than tradecraft. Yet paradoxically, those same men depended on the secrets she delivered to run their operations. Betty herself brushed off the criticism. To her, it didn't matter how the secrets were obtained, only that they were. In her words, history doesn't ask how a battle was won, only that it was the gendered battlefield. Betty Pack's career forces us to look at how gender itself was a battlefield in WWII espionage. At a time when women were expected to stay home, cook, and care for children, she was breaking into embassies, charming foreign diplomats, and altering the course of war. Her very existence was a challenge to societal norms. She wielded femininity as both shield and sword. Where a male spy might arouse suspicion, Betty's presence in diplomatic salons seemed harmless. Who would suspect that a flirtatious woman at a cocktail party was quietly memorizing documents and plotting with secret agents? In many ways, she turned society's underestimation of women into her greatest camouflage. She knew men underestimated her, and she weaponized that arrogance against them. Declassified anecdotes, declassified OS files reveal that Betty was not only skilled, but also astonishingly bold. In one mission, she reportedly stripped down to her lingerie to distract guards, while an accomplice photographed secret files. In another, she orchestrated a staged argument with a lover inside a secure embassy, deliberately raising her voice to cover the sound of locks being picked in the next room. There are even rumors, though never fully confirmed, that she smuggled sensitive documents by sewing them into her undergarments, a tactic both daring and symbolic of her unconventional style. These stories, whether embellished or true, highlight the almost cinematic nature of her work. Betty, in the eyes of the enemy, how did her targets view her? For the men she seduced, Betty was both intoxicating and dangerous. Many never realized they had been manipulated until it was too late. Some may never have realized at all. One French diplomat allegedly confessed years later that his betrayal of embassy codes was not forced, but voluntary, because he believed he was helping the woman he loved. If true, this reveals the tragic complexity of her operations. Betty didn't just manipulate lust, but genuine human emotion, a silent rivalry with Mata Hari. Whenever female spies are discussed, one name inevitably arises: Mata Hari. The Dutch exotic dancer executed in World War I for spying became the archetype of the femme fatale. Betty Pack, however, was far more effective. Unlike Mata Hari, whose actual contributions to espionage remain dubious, Betty's operations were concrete, documented, and strategically significant. Yet, because Mata Hari died dramatically before a firing squad, her legend grew larger than Betty's. Historians sometimes lament that Betty's story is overshadowed by Mata Hari's myth. Even though Betty achieved what Mata Hari never did, decisive victories in intelligence portrayal in literature and film. For decades after her death, Betty Pack remained a shadowy figure whispered about in spy circles, but absent from mainstream history books. Slowly, writers and filmmakers began to rediscover her in novels. She has been depicted as the quintessential femme fatale, mysterious, glamorous, and morally ambiguous. Some portrayals exaggerate her sexuality while downplaying her courage. Others paint her as a tragic figure caught between duty and desire. Screenwriters have toyed with her story for years, though Hollywood has yet to give her a major film, perhaps because her life raises uncomfortable questions. Is the seduction of enemies an act of patriotism or exploitation? Does celebrating her diminish the sacrifices of traditional heroes? The philosophy of seduction as a weapon. Betty Pack's career leaves us with a haunting philosophical dilemma. Can intimacy be weaponized ethically? On the one hand, her actions saved thousands of lives, every convoy spared from U-boat attacks, every battle won with advanced knowledge can be traced to the intelligence she provided. If seduction was the price, was it not justified? On the other hand, her work blurred lines between personal and professional, between love and duty. Did the men she seduced truly consent, or were they manipulated under false pretenses? Was she sacrificing only herself or also the dignity of those she tricked? The questions remain unresolved, but perhaps Betty herself would argue that in war, the moral compass is always skewed. The forgotten heroine, despite her contributions, Betty Pack's name is still largely absent from textbooks. Unlike generals or prime ministers, she was not celebrated with parades or medals. Her weapons were too unorthodox, her methods too scandalous for polite society. In fact, for years her exploits were actively downplayed. The intelligence community feared that publicizing her story would tarnish reputations and invite ridicule. Only after declassified files emerged did her true role come into light. Today, scholars argue that Betty deserves recognition alongside resistance fighters, codebreakers, and battlefield commanders. She may not have stormed beaches or flown bombers, but she altered the trajectory of war nonetheless. The Smile of Shadows. Betty Pack's story reminds us that espionage is not always about gadgets or gunfights. Sometimes it is about a whispered secret in the dark, a stolen glance across a ballroom, a kiss that conceals betrayal. She walked the thin line between intimacy and espionage, turning love itself into a battlefield. And while the world may never fully reconcile the morality of her methods, one fact is clear: without her, the map of World War II might have looked very different. She was not a soldier, she was not a general, she was something else entirely. A woman who made war her stage and seduction her sword.